The morning mist clung to the Sierra Nevada foothills like the ghosts of ancient spirits, rolling through the valley where Zechariah Bishop's ranch sprawled across 2,000 acres of stubborn land. The sun fought its way through the fog, casting long shadows from the fence posts that stretched like broken ribs toward the distant mountains. This was horse country, harsh terrain for harder men, and Zach owned more of it than he knew what to do with anymore. At 34, Zach was a man carved from granite and silence. His wife Catherine had died 3 years ago from consumption, coughing blood into white handkerchiefs until there was nothing left but empty rooms and the echo of her laughter in spaces that would never hear it again. Since then he had spoken less and worked more, building his herd of Mustangs and quarter horses while saying next to nothing to the drifters who came looking for work.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
The locals in Cedar Ridge called him the Ghost Rancher. Not cruel, just unreachable. A man who had loved once and buried that love so deep that nothing else could take root in the rocky soil of his heart. His ranch, the Double B, stretched from the oak groves in the east to the rushing waters of Bear Creek in the west. The Civil War had taken most of the able-bodied men from the valley, and those who returned often carried wounds that ran deeper than flesh. Some drank themselves to death in the saloons of Cedar Ridge. Others disappeared into the gold fields, chasing dreams that glittered like fool's gold in the mountain streams. The few ranch hands who remained were getting older, their backs bent from years of hard labor, their eyes clouded with the knowledge that their best days were behind them. By autumn of 1876, Zach's herd had grown restless. 43 horses, including some of the finest Mustang stock in Northern California, but only 2 hands to help manage them. Old Pete Hawkins, who had worked the ranch since before Catherine died, and Tommy Reeves, a kid barely 18 who knew how to muck stalls, but couldn't read horse behavior worth a damn. The animals sensed the lack of proper attention, grew skittish and hard to handle. Zach rode into Cedar Ridge one gray October morning and posted a notice on the wall of Murphy's General Store. Ranch hand needed, must know horses, room and board. Serious inquiries only. 3 weeks passed without a single response. Then one late afternoon, as the sun slanted low through the valley and cast the mountains in shades of purple and gold, a lone figure appeared on the ridge road that led down to the ranch. Small, moving with the fluid grace of someone who belonged to the wilderness rather than civilization. No horse, just walking with a steady, measured pace that suggested long distances covered without haste or urgency. Zach watched from the porch of the main house, squinting against the dying light. As the figure drew closer, he could make out more details. Young, probably not more than 16 or 17. Dark hair hanging loose to his shoulders, clothes that looked like they had been made for function rather than fashion. Buckskin pants worn soft with age, a cotton shirt the color of autumn leaves, and moccasins that made no sound on the hard-packed dirt of the ranch road. The young man approached the front gate without hesitation, moving with the quiet confidence of someone who understood that rushing never improved anything important. He was Cahto, Zach realized, recognizing the distinctive features and bearing of the tribe that had once claimed much of this valley as their ancestral homeland. Most of the Cahto had been forced onto reservations or had disappeared into the deep forests of the Coast Range, but a few still lived in the traditional ways, moving through the wilderness like shadows. "You the man looking for help with horses?" the young man asked. His voice was soft but clear, with the precise pronunciation of someone who had learned English as a second language, but spoke it well. He looked directly at Zach without the deference or fear that most people showed when approaching a white ranch owner. Zach studied him. "Depends. You know anything about horses?" "I know they are like people," the young man replied. "Each one has a different spirit. Some are born to run, some are born to carry burdens, Some are born to teach patience. To those who think they already know everything. A hint of something that might have been humor flickered in his dark eyes. I know how to listen to what they are trying to say. What's your name? Ahanu. He paused, then added, It means he laughs in my grandmother's tongue though. I have not had much reason for laughter lately. Something in the way he said it caught Zach's attention. There was loss in those words, a depth of experience that seemed too heavy for someone so young. You have family around here? Ahanu's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Not anymore. My grandmother was the last. She died 2 moons ago. Winter took her, like it takes the old oak trees that have stood too long against the wind. Zach felt an unexpected stab of recognition. He knew something about loss, about being the last one left in a place that had once been full of voices. You can try for a week, he heard himself saying. But if you slow down the work or spook the horses, you're gone. Ahanu nodded once. Fair enough. Zach pointed toward the bunkhouse, a low building with a stone chimney that sat about 50 yards from the main house. There's a bed in there. Meals at sunrise and sunset. We start work when there's enough light to see by. The young man shouldered his small pack and started toward the bunkhouse. He moved across the ranch yard with the same fluid grace Zach had noticed from a distance, his feet seeming to find the quietest path without conscious effort. Old Pete Hawkins emerged from the barn, took one look at Ahanu, and spat tobacco juice into the dirt. You hiring Indians now? Pete asked, not bothering to lower his voice. Figured you had more sense than that, Zach. Zach's jaw tightened. I'm hiring anyone who can do the work. You got a problem with that, Pete. You know where the road leads. Pete held up his hands in mock surrender. Just saying, is all. Indians got their own ways of doing things. Might not mix well with civilized folk from across the yard. Ahanu gave no sign that he had heard the exchange, but Zach noticed that his shoulders had gone rigid. The young man continued toward the bunkhouse without looking back, but there was something in his bearing now that suggested he had heard every word and was choosing not to respond. That evening, Zach found himself watching Ahanu through the window of the main house. The young man had made himself a small fire outside the bunkhouse and was sitting beside it, not eating or reading or doing any of the things most people did when they thought they were alone. Just sitting, perfectly still, listening to the sounds of the night. The horses in the nearby corral seemed to sense his presence. Several had moved closer to the fence, standing quietly with their heads turned in his direction. Sleep came hard for Zach that night. He kept thinking about the way Ahanu had answered his questions, the quiet dignity in his bearing, the sadness that seemed to shadow him like grief shadows the living. It had been 3 years since Catherine died, 3 years since he had allowed himself to feel curiosity about another person's story. He did not like the stirring of interest in his chest, the way his mind kept returning to the young Cahto's words about horses having different spirits. The next morning, Zach was up before dawn, as was his habit. He dressed quietly and stepped out onto the porch to watch the sun rise over the eastern mountains. The air was crisp with the promise of winter, carrying the scent of pine and wood smoke. As he stood there with his coffee, he saw Ahanu emerge from the bunkhouse. The young man moved through the pre-dawn darkness like he could see as clearly as a cat, making his way toward the horse corral without stumbling or hesitation. By the time Zach reached the corral, Ahanu was already inside the fence, standing motionless among the horses. The animals, which usually grew skittish when strangers entered their space, seemed completely at ease with his presence. A big bay gelding named Thunder, who had a reputation for striking at anyone who approached too quickly, was standing close. Enough to Ahanu that the young man could have reached out and touched his muzzle. How'd you do that? Zach asked quietly, not wanting to spook the horses with sudden noise. Ahanu turned slowly, careful not to make any abrupt movements. I did nothing.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
I simply became part of their world instead of trying to make them part of mine. As if to demonstrate his point, Thunder stepped forward and gently nuzzled the Hanu's shoulder. The young man reached up and stroked the horse's neck with movements so natural and unforced that it seemed like he was greeting an old friend rather than meeting a potentially dangerous animal for the first time. Thunder doesn't take to strangers, Zach observed. Took me 6 months to get him to let me put a halter on him. He has been hurt, Ahanu said simply. Someone used harsh words and harsher hands on him. He remembers pain, so he expects it from everyone who approaches. But pain is not the only thing he remembers. Somewhere in his heart, he still knows what kindness feels like. The way Ahanu spoke about the horse made Zach uncomfortable, as if the young man could see things that were hidden from everyone else. You talk about him like you can read his mind. Not his mind, Ahanu replied. His spirit. All living things carry the memory of everything that has touched them, good and bad. If you know how to listen with more than your ears, you can hear the stories they tell. Over the next hour, Zach watched Ahanu work with the horses in a way he had never seen before. The young man did not try to impose his will on the animals or force them to submit to his authority. Instead, he seemed to communicate with them through subtle changes in posture, breathing, and movement. He would approach each horse slowly, wait for some invisible signal of acceptance, then begin a careful dance of mutual respect and trust. A Mare named Starlight, who had been acting increasingly aggressive toward the other horses, calmed under Ahanu's attention. He spent nearly 20 minutes simply standing near her, occasionally murmuring words in what Zach assumed was the Cahto language. Gradually, the tension in the Mare's body relaxed, her ears stopped pinning back, and she began to nuzzle Ahanu's hands with gentle curiosity. She is carrying a foal, Ahanu said quietly. Her body is changing, and she does not understand why she feels so different. The other horses sense her confusion, and it makes them nervous. She needs to be separated from the herd until her baby comes. Zach stared at him. He had suspected Starlight might be pregnant, but the Mare was only in her early stages and showing no obvious signs. How can you tell? The way she moves, the way she breathes, the way she looks at the world, Ahanu replied. Everything changes when new life begins to grow. You just have to know what to look for. By midday, Ahanu had evaluated every horse in the herd. He moved among them with patience that seemed infinite, taking time to understand each animal's individual nature and needs. He identified a gelding with an infected hoof that had been so mild Zach had not noticed it, spotted signs of worms in 2 of the younger horses, and somehow convinced a notoriously stubborn stallion named Devil to accept a halter without a fight. Where did you learn all this? Zach asked as they broke for the noon meal. Ahanu was quiet for a moment, gazing out at the mountains that rose like sleeping giants beyond the valley. My grandfather was what you would call a horse whisperer. He said that long ago before the white settlers came. The Cahto people and the wild horses shared the same trails through these mountains. Both knew how to survive in country that could kill the weak or foolish. Both understood that wisdom came from watching and listening rather than from talking and forcing. He paused, then continued. When I was small, maybe 6 or 7 summers, my grandfather would take me into the high country where the wild herds still ran free. We would sit for hours without moving, just watching how they lived together, how they communicated, how the lead Mare decided when to run and when to rest. He taught me that horses are teachers, if you are humble enough to be their student. And your grandfather? Is he still alive? Ahanu's face grew still. He died 5 years ago. Soldiers came to our village, said we had to move to the reservation. My grandfather was old, but he had never lived anywhere but these mountains. The journey broke his heart, and his heart broke his body. He died 2 days before we reached the place where they wanted us to live. The pain in Ahanu's voice was so raw that Zach felt it like a physical blow. He thought of Catherine, of how her death had carved a hollow place in his chest that nothing had been able to fill. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, and meant it. "My grandmother brought me back." "Here afterward," Ahanu continued. "She said my grandfather's spirit would wander forever if we stayed in that place of sadness and fences. We lived in the old way, moving with the seasons, taking only what we needed. She taught me the healing plants, the way to read weather in the color of the sky, how to find water in country that looks dry as bone. But mostly, she taught me that everything in this world is connected to everything else, and that pain shared becomes lighter while joy shared becomes stronger." That afternoon, Ahanu demonstrated skills that went far beyond horse handling. When one of the fence posts on the east pasture broke, he fixed it using materials from the surrounding forest and techniques that required no nails or purchased hardware. When old Pete complained that he could not find 3 missing calves from Zach's small beef herd, Ahanu studied the ground around the last place they had been seen, then led them directly to where the animals had gotten themselves trapped in a box canyon 2 miles away. "How in the hell did you know where to look?" Pete demanded, his skepticism warring with grudging admiration. Ahanu knelt beside the muddy ground near the canyon entrance, pointing to marks in the earth that looked like random scratches to Zach. 3 sets of tracks moving fast. See how the hoof prints are deeper on the front edge. They were running from something, probably a mountain lion. The tracks lead straight into the canyon, but there are no tracks leading out. So they went in but could not find their way back. He stood and brushed the dirt from his hands. Also, I could hear them calling. Sound carries differently in a box canyon. It echoes back on itself, makes the voices sound confused and frightened. Pete spat tobacco juice and shook his head. "Well, I'll be damned. Kid's got better eyes than a hawk and better ears than a coyote." That evening, as the sun set behind the western mountains and painted the sky in shades of fire and gold, Zach found himself sitting on the porch longer than usual. Ahanu had built another small fire outside the bunkhouse and was sitting beside it, perfectly still in the growing darkness. The horses had gathered along the fence line closest to where he sat, standing quietly as if drawn by some invisible force. For the first time in 3 years, Zach felt something other than the dull ache of loss. There was curiosity in his chest, and beneath that, something that might have been hope. Ahanu moved through the world with a grace and wisdom that seemed to come from some deep well of understanding, and there was something about his presence that made the ranch feel less empty. As he watched the young Cahto tend his fire with careful, economical movements, Zach realized that he had found more than just another ranch hand. He had found someone who understood horses the way Catherine had understood the music that lived in her garden, the way his grandfather had understood the language of weather and seasons. Someone who saw connections where others saw only separation, who heard stories where others heard only noise. The night sounds of the valley seemed different with Ahanu there. The horses were quieter, their occasional whickers and snorts carrying a note of contentment that had been missing for months. Even the wind through the oak trees sounded more musical, as if the land itself was responding to the presence of someone who knew how to listen. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of whether this quiet young man could truly do the work that needed doing. But tonight, for the first time since Catherine died, Zach Bishop fell asleep not to the sound of his own loneliness, but to the gentle murmur of a voice speaking soft words to the horses in a language older than the fences and roads that had carved up the ancient wilderness. 1 week later, the first real test came during the wolf moon, when the November sky hung low and heavy with the promise of early snow. Zach had grown accustomed to Ahanu's quiet presence over the past week, watching the young Cahto move through his daily routines with an efficiency that made the other ranch hands look clumsy by comparison. But it was one thing to gentle horses, in a corral, and quite another to handle the kind of crisis that could destroy a ranch in a single night. The trouble started at supper time. Old Pete Hawkins burst through the kitchen door of the main house, his weathered face flushed with panic and exertion. "Zach, we got problems," he gasped, still catching his breath from running across the yard. "Big problems. That new stallion you bought from the Morrison place, the black one they called Midnight Storm. He's busted out of the north pasture and taken half the mares with him." Zach felt his stomach drop. Midnight Storm was a magnificent animal, 17 hands of pure muscle and fire, but he was also wild-born and had never fully accepted captivity. Zach had paid $300 for him at auction, betting that the stallion's bloodlines would improve his breeding program. But wild horses carried wild instincts, and those instincts always pulled them back toward the freedom of the high country. "How many mares?" Zach asked, already reaching for his coat and hat. "Near as I can tell, about 15, maybe more. Tommy's out there now trying to get an exact count, but it's getting dark fast and that storm's coming in from the north. If we don't get them back before the weather hits, we could lose the whole bunch to the mountain lions or the cold." 15 mares represented nearly half of Zach's breeding stock, the foundation of everything he had worked to build since Catherine's death. Without them, the Double B would be finished as a horse ranch. He might be able to survive on the small beef herd, but he would never be able to recover the investment or the years of careful breeding that had gone into developing his bloodlines. "Get the riding gear," Zach ordered. "We'll take the trail horses and try to cut them off before they reach the high passes. If that stallion gets them into the backcountry, we'll never see them again." Pete nodded and hurried toward the tack room, but Zach could see the doubt in the old man's eyes. Tracking horses in mountain country was difficult enough in daylight. At night, with a storm coming, it would be nearly impossible. They would be working by moonlight and instinct, hoping to find animals that knew the terrain better than any human. Ahanu appeared in the kitchen doorway as if he had materialized from the shadows. He moved with the same silent grace Zach had observed all week, but there was something different in his bearing now, an alertness that reminded Zach of a hunting cat scenting prey on the wind. "I heard what Pete said." Ahanu spoke quietly. "The stallion has taken the mares toward Falcon Ridge. They will follow the old deer trails up through Pine Canyon, then cross over to the grasslands on the far side of the divide." Zach stared at him. "How can you possibly know that? You've only been here a week." "I know because that is what I would do if I were a wild horse trying to lead my family to safety," Ahanu replied. "The canyon provides shelter from the wind and predators. The grasslands have water and feed. It is the logical choice for an animal thinking with instinct rather than fear." Something in the young man's certainty made Zach pause. Over the past week, he had learned to trust Asinu's judgment about horses, but this was different. This was about reading the mind of an animal he had never seen, predicting behavior based on nothing more than understanding and intuition. "Even if you're right about the direction, we'll never catch them on horseback in the dark," Zach said. "The trail up Pine Canyon is too treacherous, and we don't know how much of a head start they have. We do not need to catch them," Ahanu said. "We only need to reach them before they cross the divide. Once they are on the other side, they will scatter. But if we can get ahead of them at the pass, we can turn them back." Pete returned from the tack room carrying saddles and bridles, but he stopped short when he saw Ahanu standing in the kitchen. "What's the Indian doing here? This ain't work for a boy." "Ahanu knows where the horses went," Zach said. "He's coming with us." Pete's face darkened. "Zach, I've been tracking lost stock in these mountains for 30 years. I don't need some kid telling me which way horses run." "Then you tell me," Zach shot back. "Which way did they go?" Pete hesitated, then gestured vaguely toward the north. "Up toward the ridgeline, most likely. Horses always head for high ground when they're spooked." "And then what?" Zach pressed. "Once they reach the ridge, which way do they turn?" East toward the mining camps where they'll get shot for horse. Thieves, west toward the coast, where the terrain will break their legs. Or north into the deep wilderness, where we'll never find them. Pete's mouth worked silently. He was a good ranch hand and a decent tracker, but his knowledge came from experience with domestic animals in familiar territory. Wild horses followed. Different rules that most white men had never learned. Pine Canyon, Ahanu said again, his voice calm and certain. They will follow the canyon floor until it opens onto the high meadows. If we take the ridge trail and ride hard, we can reach the pass before they do. But we need to leave now, before the moon sets. Zach made his decision. Pete, you and Tommy stay here and secure the other stock. Make sure nothing else gets out. Ahanu and I will go after the runaways. You're making a mistake, Pete warned. Taking an Indian boy into country like that, in weather like this. Catherine wouldn't have wanted. Catherine's dead. Zach cut him off with a sharpness that surprised even himself. I'm the one making decisions now, and I'm deciding to trust the person who's shown the best judgment with horses since he got here. Pete's face flushed, but he kept his mouth shut. He had worked for the Double B long enough to know when Zach's mind was made up. The old ranch hand turned and stalked back toward the bunkhouse, his displeasure evident in every line of his body. 20 minutes later, Zach and Ahanu rode out of the ranch yard on the two best trail horses in the string. The wind had picked up, sending dead leaves skittering across their path like ghostly messengers. The moon hung low in the western sky, casting everything in silver and shadow. They could smell snow in the air, the sharp metallic scent that meant winter was coming whether they were ready or not. Ahanu led the way, guiding them along a narrow game trail that Zach had never noticed before. The young man rode bareback on a sturdy pinto mare named Painted Sky, moving with her rhythm as if they were a single creature. He seemed to navigate by instincts that went beyond sight, occasionally pausing to listen to sounds that Zach could not hear or to study signs that were invisible in the moonlight. How do you know this trail? Zach asked as they climbed steadily upward through stands of pine and oak. My grandfather showed it to me, Ahanu replied. He said the old people used it to reach the sacred places in the high country. It follows the ridgeline but stays below the worst winds. Animals know about it too. Deer, elk, wild horses. They all use the same paths through these mountains. They rode in silence for the next hour. The only sounds the steady rhythm of hoofbeats on stone and the whisper of wind through the trees. Zach found himself watching Ahanu's back, noting the way the young man sat his horse, the way he seemed to read the landscape around them. There was something almost supernatural about his confidence, as if he possessed knowledge that other men could only guess at. As they climbed higher, the temperature dropped and the wind grew stronger. Zach pulled his coat tighter and was grateful for the warm hat Catherine had knitted for him 3 winters ago. But Ahanu seemed unaffected by the cold, riding with the same easy grace he had shown in the corral, his cotton shirt and buckskin pants apparently providing all the warmth he needed. Aren't you cold? Zach asked. Cold is just another kind of weather, Ahanu replied, like rain or heat or wind. If you fight against it, it becomes your enemy. If you accept it and work with it, it becomes just part of the world you move through. They reached the ridge trail just as the moon began to set behind the western peaks. The world around them shifted from silver to deep blue, then to the absolute black that comes before dawn. But Ahanu never hesitated, guiding them along paths that seemed to exist more in his memory than in any physical reality. How can you see where we're going? Zach asked, his own vision reduced to vague shapes and deeper shadows. I am not seeing with my eyes, Ahanu said. I am feeling the trail with my horse's feet, listening to the wind tell me about obstacles ahead, using my nose to smell water and sage and the places where animals have passed. The darkness is only a problem if you depend on only one sense to understand the world. As if to prove his point, Ahanu suddenly raised his hand and brought his horse to a stop. Zach reined in beside him, straining to see or hear whatever had caught the young man's attention. For a long moment, they sat motionless in the darkness, the only sound the breathing of their horses and the rustle of wind through the trees. Then Zach heard it too. Faint but unmistakable, the sound of many hooves moving over rocky ground, accompanied by the occasional whinny or snort of horses communicating with each other. The sound was coming from below them, from the direction of Pine Canyon. "They are moving faster than I expected," Ahanu said quietly. "The stallion is pushing them hard. He knows the storm is coming and wants to reach the high meadows before it hits. How much time do we have?" Ahanu tilted his head, listening with an intensity that reminded Zach of a wolf testing the wind. "Maybe an hour, maybe less. We need to reach the pass before they do, or they will scatter into country where even I cannot track them." They pushed their horses harder, following the ridge trail as it wound between stands of pine and across open meadows where the grass crunched under their horses' hooves. The temperature continued to drop, and Zach could feel the first scattered snowflakes beginning to fall. The storm was moving in faster than expected. As they rode, Ahanu began to speak in his own language, a flowing stream of words that rose and fell like music. Zach could not understand the meaning, but there was something in the rhythm and tone that seemed to calm both horses and rider. It was as if the young man was singing them through the darkness, using his voice to weave a thread of confidence through the uncertainty of the night. "What are you saying?" Zach asked during a brief pause. "I am asking my grandfather's spirit to guide us," Ahanu replied. "And I am telling the horses we are following that we mean them no harm, that we only want to bring them safely home." Sometimes animals can hear intentions, even when they cannot see the people who carry them. They reached the pass just as the eastern sky began to show the first faint hint of dawn. Below them, Pine Canyon opened into a broad meadow where scattered patches of snow gleamed like scattered coins in the growing light. And there, moving steadily upward along the canyon floor, was the dark mass of the missing horses. Midnight Storm led the group, his black coat so dark he seemed like a moving shadow against the lighter-colored mares that followed him. Even from a distance, Zach could see the power and grace in the stallion's movement, the wild pride that had made him so difficult to contain. Behind him came the mares, moving in the loose formation that wild horses used when traveling through dangerous country. "They will reach the pass in maybe 20 minutes, Ahanu observed. "Once they cross over, they will be in wilderness that stretches for hundreds of miles. We will never see them again." Zach felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the same helpless panic he had felt when Catherine was dying, and there was nothing he could do to save her. 15 mares represented years of work, thousands of dollars in investment, and the foundation of every plan he had made for the future of the Double B. Without them, he would be just another failed rancher, scraping by on stubbornness and diminishing hope. "What do we do?" he asked. Ahanu was quiet for a moment, studying the terrain below them with the same intensity he had shown when evaluating horses in the corral. Then his face brightened with something that might have been inspiration. "We do not try to stop them," he said. "We convince them to stop themselves." Before Zach could ask what he meant, Ahanu had urged his horse forward along a narrow ledge that led down toward the canyon floor. The path was treacherous, barely wide enough for a horse and rider, with loose rocks that could send them tumbling into the canyon if a horse made a wrong step. But Painted Sky picked her way down the slope with the sure-footed confidence of a mountain goat, and Ahanu rode her with complete trust in her judgment. Zach followed, his heart hammering against his ribs as his gelding negotiated the steep descent. He was a competent rider, but this kind of terrain required skills he had never needed to develop. One wrong move, one moment of carelessness, and both horse and rider would be broken on the rocks below. they reached the canyon floor. Just as the leading edge of the horse herd entered the narrow defile that led to the pass, Midnight Storm was perhaps 200 yards away, close enough that Zack could see the steam rising from his nostrils in the cold air. The stallion had noticed their presence and was watching them warily, but he had not yet decided whether they represented a threat. Ahanu dismounted and handed his reins to Zack. "Keep the horses quiet," he said. "What I am about to do will either work perfectly or fail completely. If it fails, ride back to the ranch as fast as you can and do not look back. What are you going to do?" But Ahanu was already walking away, moving toward the approaching herd with the same calm confidence he had shown in the corral. He walked slowly, his hands visible and empty, making no sudden movements that might spook the animals. As he walked, he began to sing again, but this time the song was different. Deeper, more complex, with harmonies that seemed to echo off the canyon walls. Midnight Storm stopped when Ahanu was still 50 yards away. The stallion's head came up, his ears pricked forward, his entire body radiating alertness. Behind him, the mares milled uncertainly, sensing their leader's indecision. The moment balanced on a knife's edge, everything depending on how the wild stallion chose to interpret the strange human's intentions. Ahanu continued his approach, never speeding up or slowing down, his voice weaving through the morning air like visible threads of music. When he was 20 yards from the stallion, he stopped and sat down cross-legged on the rocky ground. He made himself small, non-threatening, just a young man sitting alone in a canyon, singing to the wind. For long minutes, nothing happened. The stallion stood motionless, his dark eyes fixed on Ahanu with the intensity of a predator evaluating prey. The mares clustered behind him, their nervousness evident in the way they shifted and stamped. Snow continued to fall, dusting everything with white powder that made the scene look like something from a dream. Then, impossibly, Midnight Storm took a step forward. Then another. The stallion approached Ahanu with the careful wariness of a wild creature testing the intentions of a potential threat, but there was curiosity in his movement as well. Something in the young man's song had reached past the stallion's fear and touched a deeper part of his nature. When the great black horse was close enough to touch, Ahanu slowly extended his hand, not reaching toward the stallion, but simply offering his palm for inspection. Midnight Storm stretched his neck forward, his velvet nostrils flaring as he tested the young man's scent. For a heartbeat, Zack thought the stallion might strike a rear, but instead, the wild horse gently touched his muzzle to Ahanu's palm. What happened next was unlike anything Zack had ever seen. Ahanu rose slowly to his feet, his hand still extended toward the stallion. The great horse allowed the touch, then seemed to lean into it, as if drawing comfort from the contact. The young man continued his song, but now it was softer, more intimate, like a lullaby sung to calm a frightened child, without any visible signal from Ahanu. Midnight Storm began to turn back toward the way he had come. The stallion moved. Slowly, almost reluctantly, but there was no fight in him now. Behind him, the mares fell into line, following their leader back down the canyon toward the distant ranch. It was as if Ahanu had reminded them of something they had forgotten, some deeper truth about home and safety and belonging. Zack sat on his horse in amazement, watching $15,000 worth of livestock voluntarily return to captivity, because a 17-year-old Cahto boy had asked them to in a language older than words. It was impossible, but it was happening before his eyes. Ahanu had accomplished in 10 minutes what a dozen cowboys with ropes and determination might not have managed in a week. The journey back to the Double B took most of the morning. Ahanu walked ahead of the herd, still singing softly, occasionally, pausing to let the animals rest or to guide them around obstacles. The horses followed him with the docility of domestic animals, but Zack could see the wildness still burning in Midnight Storm's eyes. The stallion had chosen to return, but he had not surrendered his essential nature. By the time they reached the ranch, the snow was falling steadily and the wind had picked up to a howl that rattled the windows of the main house. They got the horses into the barn just as the storm hit with full force, turning the world outside into a whirling white chaos that would have meant death for any creature caught in the open. Pete Hawkins met them at the barn door, his weathered face slack with amazement. "I saw them coming down the trail," he said, staring at Ahanu with something approaching awe. "Saw that black devil following the boy like a trained dog. How in the hell did you manage that?" Ahanu was brushing down painted sky, his movements as calm and methodical as if he had just returned from a pleasant ride around the ranch. "I reminded them that they had a choice," he said simply. "They could face the storm alone in the wilderness, or they could face it together in a place where there was shelter and food and care. When you give animals a real choice, they usually choose wisely." That night, as the storm raged outside and the ranch buildings creaked under the assault of wind and snow, Zach found himself unable to sleep. He kept thinking about what he had witnessed in the canyon, about the impossible sight of a wild stallion choosing captivity over freedom because a young man had asked him to. It challenged everything he thought he knew about animals, about power, about the relationship between human will and natural instinct. More than that, it challenged everything he thought he knew about Ahanu, the quiet young man who had arrived at his ranch a week ago was clearly much more than a simple horse handler looking for work. He possessed knowledge and abilities that went far beyond anything Zach had encountered, skills that seemed to bridge the gap between the human world and something older and wilder. As he lay in bed listening to the wind howl around the eaves of the house, Zach realized that saving the horses was only part of what had happened today. Something deeper had shifted, some fundamental change in the way he saw both his ranch and his life. For 3 years he had been trying to hold on to the past, to preserve the memory of what the Double B had been when Catherine was alive. But Ahanu had shown him that preservation was not the same as growth, that honoring the past did not require remaining trapped by it. The young Cahto had given him back his horses, but more importantly, he had given him back a sense of possibility. For the first time since Catherine died, Zach Bishop began to believe that the future might hold something more than just endurance. 2 weeks after the Wolf Moon incident, the first sign of trouble came at dawn on a Tuesday that started like any other. Zach was splitting firewood behind the main house when he heard Ahanu's voice, calling from the direction of the horse barn, urgent but controlled in the way that meant serious problems without panic. The tone made Zach drop his axe and run toward the sound, his boots slipping on the frost-covered ground. He found Ahanu kneeling beside Thunder, the big bay gelding who had been the first horse to accept the young Cahto's touch 2 weeks earlier. The animal was down on his side in the stall, his breathing labored and his dark eyes wide with pain and confusion. Foam flecked his muzzle, and his powerful body shuddered with each breath. "What happened?" Zach asked, dropping to his knees. "Beside them, colic," Ahanu said, his hands moving gently over the horse's distended belly. "Bad colic. His stomach is twisted, cutting off the blood flow. If we cannot get it to untwist soon, he will die." Zach felt his heart sink. He had seen horses die from colic before, had watched them thrash in agony until merciful death released them from pain. It was one of the cruelest ways for such magnificent creatures to die, their own bodies betraying them with a condition that could strike without warning and kill within hours. "I'll ride to Cedar Ridge and get Doc Patterson," Zach said, already rising to his feet. The veterinarian was 60 miles away, but he was the only man within 100 miles who might be able to help. "There is no time," Ahanu replied quietly. "By the time you return, Thunder will be gone. But there is another way, if you trust me." Something in the young man's voice made Zach pause. There was certainty there, but also a weight of responsibility that seemed too heavy for someone barely past boyhood. "What do you mean?" Ahanu's hands continued their gentle exploration of the horse's belly, his fingers seeming to read information that was invisible to anyone else. My grandmother taught me the old healing ways. Not just for people, but for all living things. There are techniques, methods that go back to the time before horses wore saddles or lived behind fences. You're talking about Indian medicine, Zach said, and immediately regretted the skepticism in his voice. I am talking about understanding. How life flows through all creatures, Ahanu corrected gently. About finding the places where that flow gets blocked and helping it move freely again. Your people call it medicine. My people call it listening to what the body is trying to say. Thunder's breathing became more labored, and his legs began to jerk in involuntary spasms. The horse was clearly suffering, and suffering badly. Zach had faced this decision before, and he knew what most ranchers would do. A quick bullet would end the animal's pain and save hours of watching him die slowly, but as he looked at Ahanu's face, saw the absolute concentration and compassion there, he found himself unable to give up hope. The young man had already worked miracles with the horses, had demonstrated abilities that defied logical explanation. If there was any chance, any possibility at all, what do you need me to do? Zach asked. Ahanu's eyes widened slightly, as if he had not expected trust to come so easily. Help me move him to the center of the stall, away from the walls. Then bring me warm water, clean cloths, and the bottle of whiskey from your kitchen. And Zach, he paused, meeting the older man's eyes directly. What you are about to see may seem strange to you. I ask only that you do not interfere, no matter what happens. 20 minutes later, Thunder lay in the center of his stall on a bed of fresh straw, his massive head cradled in Zach's lap while Ahanu prepared for whatever healing ritual he had learned from his grandmother. The young man had removed his shirt and moccasins, working now in just his buckskin pants. His chest and arms were marked with what looked like ritual scars, thin white lines that formed patterns Zach did not recognize. Ahanu began by cleaning his hands thoroughly with the whiskey, then dipping them in the warm water. He closed his eyes and began to speak in the Cahto language, his voice rising and falling in rhythms that seemed to match Thunder's labored breathing. As he chanted, he placed his hands on different parts of the horse's body, starting at the head and working slowly toward the belly. At first, nothing seemed to happen. Thunder continued to suffer, his breathing remaining shallow and painful. But gradually, Zach began to notice subtle changes. The horse's eyes, which had been wild with pain, began to focus more clearly. His breathing, while still labored, developed a steadier rhythm. Most remarkably, he seemed to be listening to Ahanu's voice, his ears swiveling to track the sound. When Ahanu's hands reached Thunder's swollen belly, the young man's chanting changed. The words became deeper, more urgent, as if he was engaged in some kind of negotiation or plea. His hands pressed gently but firmly against the horse's side, moving in slow circles that seemed to follow some internal pattern only he could sense. What are you doing? Zach whispered. I am asking his body to remember how to heal itself. Ahanu replied without opening his eyes. Every living thing knows how to be whole and healthy. Sometimes they just forget, or the pain becomes so loud that they cannot hear. The quieter voice of healing. I am helping Thunder find that voice again, as if responding to his words. Thunder suddenly drew a deeper breath than he had managed since the episode began. His legs stopped their spasmodic jerking, and some of the wildness left his eyes. Ahanu's hands continued their slow, rhythmic movement over the horse's belly, and gradually the swelling began to subside. What happened next challenged everything Zach thought he knew about the nature of reality. As Ahanu's chanting reached a crescendo, Thunder's entire body seemed to relax in a way that went beyond simple muscle tension. It was as if some invisible knot had been untied, some blocked channel had been cleared. The horse drew a long shuddering breath, then another, and then his breathing settled into the steady rhythm of peaceful sleep. Ahanu sat back on his heels, sweat beading his forehead despite the cold morning air. His hands were trembling slightly, and his face was pale with exhaustion. "It is done," he said simply. "The twist has released itself. His body remembers how to be healthy again." Zach stared at Thunder, hardly daring to believe what he was seeing. The horse that had been dying in agony minutes earlier was now breathing easily, his belly no longer distended, his eyes clear and calm. It was impossible, but it was happening before his eyes. How? Was all he could manage to say. Ahanu reached for his shirt, his movements slow and careful, as if the healing had drained something essential from him. "My grandmother used to say that sickness is just life force flowing in the wrong direction. If you can find where it got turned around and help it remember the right path, the body will heal itself. The hard part is learning to listen carefully enough to hear what the body is trying to say." Over the next hour, they watched Thunder gradually return to full consciousness. The horse accepted water, then a small amount of grain, showing none of the distress that had nearly killed him earlier. By midday, he was standing and moving normally, as if the morning's crisis had been nothing more than a bad dream. Word of Thunder's miraculous recovery spread quickly through the small community around Cedar Ridge. Ranch hands were notorious gossips, and the story of the young Indian who could heal dying horses with nothing but his hands and some strange chanting grew larger with each telling. Some versions had Ahanu bringing the horse back from actual death. Others claimed he had performed surgery using only his fingernails and mystical powers. The first visitor arrived 3 days later. Sarah Henderson, the widow who ran the small farm adjacent to the Double B's eastern boundary, came riding up to the main house, leading a limping mare behind her. The woman's face was tight with the kind of desperation that came from watching something precious slip away, despite all efforts to save it. "Mr. Bishop," she called from her saddle, "I hope you'll forgive the intrusion, but I heard about what happened with your horse Thunder. My mare Rosie here stepped in a gopher hole 2 weeks ago, and the injury isn't healing right. Doc Patterson says there's nothing more he can do, that I should probably put her down before the infection spreads." Zach looked at the mare and could see immediately why the veterinarian had been pessimistic. The animal's right foreleg was swollen from hoof to knee, and she was holding it completely off the ground. Even from a distance, he could smell the sickly sweet odor of infected tissue. "Mrs. Henderson, I appreciate your faith in us, but I'm not sure we can help," Zach began. But Ahanu had already emerged from the barn and was walking toward them with the quiet purposefulness that meant he had made his own assessment of the situation. "May I look at her?" Ahanu asked Sarah, his voice gentle but confident. Sarah Henderson had lived on the frontier long enough to be skeptical of most claims and most people, but there was something in the young man's bearing that made her nod. "I'd be grateful. Rosie's been with me since my husband died 5 years ago. She's about all the family I have left." Ahanu approached the mare slowly, speaking to her in the same soft Cahto words he had used with Thunder. Rosie's ears pricked forward, and despite her obvious pain, she allowed him to examine her injured leg. His hands moved with the same careful sensitivity Zach had observed during the colic treatment, reading information through touch that remained invisible to everyone else. "The bone is not broken," Ahanu said after several minutes of examination. "But there is poison in the wound that her body cannot fight alone. It will take time, maybe several days, but I believe she can heal." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "I can pay you something, not much, but you can pay me by trusting me to help her," Ahanu replied. "Bring her back tomorrow morning and every morning after that until she is well. The healing will happen gradually, not all at once. Over the next 2 weeks, Sarah Henderson brought Rosie to the Double B every day." Zach watched Ahanu work with the mare, using techniques that seemed to combine practical wound care with something that went far beyond conventional veterinary medicine. He cleaned the injury with solutions made from plants he gathered in the surrounding hills, applied poultices that smelled of herbs and earth, and spent long periods simply holding his hands near the infected area while chanting in his grandmother's language. Gradually, impossibly, the Mari began to improve. The swelling reduced, the smell of infection faded, and healthy pink tissue began to replace the blackened flesh that had threatened to kill her. By the end of the second week, Rosie was putting weight on the leg again. By the end of the third, she was walking normally. Sarah Henderson was not the only visitor. Word of Ahanu's healing abilities spread throughout the valley, bringing a steady stream of people with sick or injured animals. A rancher from the next county overbrought a prize bull that had been gored by another animal and was dying from the infection. A family of homesteaders arrived with their milk cow, who had stopped giving milk after a difficult calving. An old prospector led his ancient mule down from the hills, the animal so arthritic it could barely walk. In each case, Ahanu approached the sick animal with the same combination of practical knowledge and mystical understanding. He never promised miracles, never claimed powers he did not possess. But he listened to what each creature's body was trying to tell him, and more often than not, he found ways to help the natural healing process work more effectively. Not every case was successful. The bull with the infected wound was too far gone when he arrived, and despite Ahanu's best efforts, the animal died 2 days later. But even in failure, there was something about the young man's approach that brought comfort to both animals and their owners. He helped the bull die peacefully, without the agony that had been consuming him, and somehow made the loss easier for the rancher to bear. How do you know which ones you can help and which ones you can't? Zach asked one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the western mountains. Ahanu was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the distant peaks where the last light of day painted the snow-covered summits in shades of rose and gold. My grandmother used to say that everything that lives carries a flame inside it, he said finally. Sometimes the flame burns bright and strong. Sometimes it flickers and grows dim, but as long as it still burns, there's hope for healing. When the flame goes out, when the spirit decides it is time to return to the earth, then all we can do is help make the journey as peaceful as possible. And you can see these flames? Not see exactly. Feel, maybe, or hear. It is hard to explain in English. Your language has many words for things you can touch or count, but not so many words for things that exist between the visible and the invisible. As autumn deepened into early winter, the stream of visitors continued. Ahanu's reputation spread far beyond the immediate area, drawing people from as far away as Sacramento and even San Francisco. Some came with genuine need, desperate to save beloved animals that conventional medicine had given up on. Others came out of curiosity, hoping to witness something that would confirm or deny the stories they had heard. The attention made Zach uncomfortable. He had grown accustomed to the quiet rhythms of ranch life, to the predictable routines of caring for animals and maintaining property. The constant stream of strangers disrupted that peace, bringing with them expectations and demands that neither he nor Ahanu had asked for. More troubling were the visitors who came not seeking help, but looking for proof that Ahanu was either a fraud or something more dangerous. A group of men from Cedar Ridge arrived one afternoon, led by Reverend Marcus Whitfield, the Methodist minister who had been preaching against heathen practices since word of Ahanu's abilities first reached town. "Mr. Bishop," Reverend Whitfield announced as he dismounted from his buggy, "we've come to see this Indian boy who claims to have supernatural powers. As God-fearing Christians, we cannot allow devil worship and witchcraft to take root in our community." Zach felt his temper rise. The past month had shown him sides of Ahanu that went far beyond his initial skills with horses. The young man possessed a depth of compassion and wisdom that seemed to come from sources far older and deeper than any formal education. To hear him accused of devil worship was not just wrong, it was insulting. "Reverend," Zach said carefully, "Ahanu has done nothing but help sick animals get well. If that's devil worship, then maybe your definition of evil needs some adjustment. The boy uses heathen chants and rituals, one of the other men declared. He practices medicine without training or authority. For all we know, he's poisoning these animals and then pretending to cure them for his own profit. Before Zach could respond, a Hanu appeared from the direction of the barn. He had been working with a horse that belonged to one of the visitors. A Mare with a chronic lameness that conventional veterinary care had been unable to resolve. The young man's face showed no reaction to the accusations, but Zach could see the weariness in his eyes. "You have concerns about my methods," a Hanu said to the group, his voice calm and respectful. "That is understandable. What I do is different from what you are used to seeing. But I ask you to judge me by the results, not by your fear of what you do not understand." "We don't need to judge anything," Reverend Whitfield replied stiffly. "The Bible is clear about consorting with familiar spirits and practicing divination. These are abominations in the sight of the Lord." Ahanu nodded slowly. "I respect your beliefs, just as I hope you will respect mine. My grandmother taught me that there are many paths to understanding the sacred, and that the Great Spirit reveals himself differently to different peoples. What you call God, we call the Creator. What you call prayer, we call communion with the spirits of all living things. The names are different, but the source of all healing is the same." The theological discussion might have continued indefinitely, but it was interrupted by the arrival of another visitor. A well-dressed man in his 50s rode up to the group, his expensive clothes and confident bearing marking him as someone accustomed to authority and respect. "Gentlemen," the newcomer said as he dismounted from a beautiful black gelding, "I'm Dr. Edmund Carstairs from the University of California. I've traveled a considerable distance to observe the medical practices being performed here." Zach recognized the name. Dr. Carstairs was a famous physician and researcher who had written extensively about frontier medicine and indigenous healing practices. His presence changed the dynamic of the confrontation immediately. "Doctor," Reverend Whitfield said, clearly pleased to have academic support for his position, "perhaps you can explain to Mr. Bishop why allowing this boy to practice medicine without proper training poses a danger to the entire community." Dr. Carstairs looked at Ahanu with the careful attention of a scientist examining an interesting specimen. "Actually, Reverend, I'm here to learn, not to condemn. Indigenous medical practices often contain knowledge that formal medicine has overlooked or forgotten. If this young man has genuinely effective treatments, dismissing them because of their cultural origins would be both foolish and wasteful." He turned to Ahanu directly. "I understand you've had remarkable success treating conditions that conventional veterinary medicine considers hopeless. Would you be willing to demonstrate your methods under controlled conditions?" Ahanu met the doctor's gaze steadily. "I will help any animal that is brought to me, regardless of who is watching or why. But I will not perform healing like a circus trick for the entertainment of people who have already decided what they believe." Dr. Carstairs smiled. "Spoken like a true physician. The best healers I've known, regardless of their training, share that same commitment to their patients' welfare above all other considerations." The confrontation ended without resolution, the various factions departing with their original beliefs largely intact. But the visit marked a turning point in how Ahanu's presence at the Double B was perceived by the wider community. He was no longer just an unusually skilled ranch hand, but a figure of controversy who attracted both desperate hope and fearful suspicion. That night, as they sat by the fire in the main house sharing a simple dinner, Zach found himself studying Ahanu's face in the flickering light. The young man seemed older somehow, worn down by the weight of expectations and accusations that had nothing to do with his simple desire to help suffering creatures. "Do you regret coming here?" Zach asked quietly. Ahanu was silent for a long moment, staring into the flames as if seeking guidance from their dancing patterns. "My grandmother used to say that gifts are not given to be hidden, but that sharing them always comes with a price. I knew that healing animals would bring attention, But I did not know it would bring so much fear and anger. You could leave, Zack said, though the words felt like swallowing glass. Find somewhere quieter where people wouldn't bother you. I could, Ahanu agreed. But running away from fear does not make it disappear. It only moves the problem to a different place. Besides, he looked directly at Zack. I have found something here that I did not expect to find. What's that? Home, Ahanu said simply. And someone who trusts me not because of what I can do, but because of who I am. That is not something I am willing to abandon easily. Outside, the winter wind howled around the ranch buildings, carrying with it the promise of harder weather to come. But inside the house, warmed by fire and friendship, Zack Bishop realized that his life had changed in ways he was only beginning to understand. The lonely rancher who had hired a Cahto boy to tend his horses had found something far more valuable than skilled labor. He had found a connection to wisdom and wonder that he had thought was lost forever. Sarah Henderson was not the only visitor. Word of Ahanu's healing abilities spread throughout the valley, bringing a steady stream of people with sick or injured animals. A rancher from the next county overbought a prize bull that had been gored by another animal and was dying from the infection. A family of homesteaders arrived with their milk cow, who had stopped giving milk after a difficult calving. An old prospector led his ancient mule down from the hills, the animal so arthritic it could barely walk. In each case, Ahanu approached the sick animal with the same combination of practical knowledge and mystical understanding. He never promised miracles, never claimed powers he did not possess. But he listened to what each creature's body was trying to tell him, and more often than not, he found ways to help the natural healing process work more effectively. Not every case was successful. The bull with the infected wound was too far gone when he arrived, and despite Ahanu's best efforts, the animal died 2 days later. But even in failure, there was something about the young man's approach that brought comfort to both animals and their owners. He helped the bull die peacefully, without the agony that had been consuming him, and somehow made the loss easier for the rancher to bear. How do you know which ones you can help and which ones you can't? Zack asked one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the western mountains. Ahanu was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the distant peaks where the last light of day painted the snow-covered summits in shades of rose and gold. My grandmother used to say that everything that lives carries a flame inside it, he said finally. Sometimes the flame burns bright and strong. Sometimes it flickers and grows dim, but as long as it still burns, there's hope for healing. When the flame goes out, when the spirit decides it is time to return to the earth, then all we can do is help make the journey as peaceful as possible. And you can see these flames? Not see exactly. Feel, maybe, or hear. It is hard to explain in English. Your language has many words for things you can touch or count, but not so many words for things that exist between the visible and the invisible. As autumn deepened into early winter, the stream of visitors continued. Ahanu's reputation spread far beyond the immediate area, drawing people from as far away as Sacramento and even San Francisco. Some came with genuine need, desperate to save beloved animals that conventional medicine had given up on. Others came out of curiosity, hoping to witness something that would confirm or deny the stories they had heard. The attention made Zack uncomfortable. He had grown accustomed to the quiet rhythms of ranch life, to the predictable routines of caring for animals and maintaining property. The constant stream of strangers disrupted that peace, bringing with them expectations and demands that neither he nor Ahanu had asked for. More troubling were the visitors who came not seeking help, but looking for proof that Ahanu was either a fraud or something more dangerous. A group of men from Cedar Ridge arrived one afternoon, led by Reverend Marcus Whitfield, the Methodist minister who had been preaching against heathen practices since word of Ahanu's abilities first reached town. "Mr. Bishop," Reverend Whitfield announced as he dismounted from his buggy, We've come to see this Indian boy who claims to have supernatural powers. As God-fearing Christians, we cannot allow devil worship and witchcraft to take root in our community." Zach felt his temper rise. The past month had shown him sides of a Hanu that went far beyond his initial skills with horses. The young man possessed a depth of compassion and wisdom that seemed to come from sources far older and deeper than any formal education. To hear him accused of devil worship was not just wrong, it was insulting. "Reverend," Zach said carefully, "a Hanu has done nothing but help sick animals get well. If that's devil worship, then maybe your definition of evil needs some adjustment." "The boy uses heathen chants and rituals," one of the other men declared. "He practices medicine without training or authority. For all we know, he's poisoning these animals and then pretending to cure them for his own profit." Before Zach could respond, a Hanu appeared from the direction of the barn. He had been working with a horse that belonged to one of the visitors. A mare with a chronic lameness that conventional veterinary care had been unable to resolve. The young man's face showed no reaction to the accusations, but Zach could see the weariness in his eyes. "You have concerns about my methods," a Hanu said to the group, his voice calm and respectful. "That is understandable. What I do is different from what you are used to seeing. But I ask you to judge me by the results, not by your fear of what you do not understand." "We don't need to judge anything," Reverend Whitfield replied stiffly. "The Bible is clear about consorting with familiar spirits and practicing divination. These are abominations in the sight of the Lord." Ahanu nodded slowly. "I respect your beliefs, just as I hope you will respect mine. My grandmother taught me that there are many paths to understanding the sacred, and that the Great Spirit reveals himself differently to different peoples. What you call God, we call the Creator. What you call prayer, we call communion with the spirits of all living things. The names are different, but the source of all healing is the same." The theological discussion might have continued indefinitely, but it was interrupted by the arrival of another visitor. A well-dressed man in his 50s rode up to the group, his expensive clothes and confident bearing marking him as someone accustomed to authority and respect. "Gentlemen," the newcomer said as he dismounted from a beautiful black gelding, "I'm Dr. Edmund Carstairs from the University of California. I've traveled a considerable distance to observe the medical practices being performed here." Zach recognized the name. Dr. Carstairs was a famous physician and researcher who had written extensively about frontier medicine and indigenous healing practices. His presence changed the dynamic of the confrontation immediately. "Doctor," Reverend Whitfield said, clearly pleased to have academic support for his position, "perhaps you can explain to Mr. Bishop why allowing this boy to practice medicine without proper training poses a danger to the entire community." Dr. Carstairs looked at Ahanu with the careful attention of a scientist examining an interesting specimen. "Actually, Reverend, I'm here to learn, not to condemn. Indigenous medical practices often contain knowledge that formal medicine has overlooked or forgotten. If this young man has genuinely effective treatments, dismissing them because of their cultural origins would be both foolish and wasteful." He turned to Ahanu directly. "I understand you've had remarkable success treating conditions that conventional veterinary medicine considers hopeless. Would you be willing to demonstrate your methods under controlled conditions?" Ahanu met the doctor's gaze steadily. "I will help any animal that is brought to me, regardless of who is watching or why. But I will not perform healing like a circus trick for the entertainment of people who have already decided what they believe." Dr. Carstairs smiled. "Spoken like a true physician. The best healers I've known, regardless of their training, share that same commitment to their patients' welfare above all other considerations." The confrontation ended without resolution, the various factions departing with their original beliefs largely intact. But the visit marked a turning point in how Ahanu's presence at the Double B was perceived by the wider community. He was no longer just an unusually skilled ranch hand, but a figure of controversy who attracted both desperate hope and fearful suspicion. That night, As they sat by the fire in the main house sharing a simple dinner, Zach found himself studying Ahanu's face in the flickering light. The young man seemed older somehow, worn down by the weight of expectations and accusations that had nothing to do with his simple desire to help suffering creatures. "Do you regret coming here?" Zach asked quietly. Ahanu was silent for a long moment, staring into the flames as if seeking guidance from their dancing patterns. "My grandmother used to say that gifts are not given to be hidden, but that sharing them always comes with a price. I knew that healing animals would bring attention, but I did not know it would bring so much fear and anger." "You could leave," Zach said, though the words felt like swallowing glass. "Find somewhere quieter where people wouldn't bother you." "I could," Ahanu agreed. "But running away from fear does not make it disappear. It only moves the problem to a different place. Besides," he looked directly at Zach, "I have found something here that I did not expect to find." "What's that?" "Home," Ahanu said simply. "And someone who trusts me not because of what I can do, but because of who I am. That is not something I am willing to abandon easily." Outside, the winter wind howled around the ranch buildings, carrying with it the promise of harder weather to come. But inside the house, warmed by fire and friendship, Zach Bishop realized that his life had changed in ways he was only beginning to understand. The lonely rancher who had hired a Cahto boy to tend his horses had found something far more valuable than skilled labor. He had found a connection to wisdom and wonder that he had thought was lost forever. Late December, 1876, the attack came on the night of the winter solstice, when the darkness seemed to press against the windows of the ranch house like something alive and hungry. Zach woke to the sound of gunshots echoing across the valley, sharp cracks that shattered the crystalline silence of the frozen night. He rolled out of bed, grabbed his rifle from beside the door, and rushed to the window that faced the horse corrals. What he saw made his blood turn to ice water in his veins. Masked riders were cutting through his fences with wire cutters, driving his prize horses into the darkness beyond the reach of the ranch's lantern light. The attackers moved with military precision, each man knowing exactly what his role was in the carefully orchestrated theft. They had come prepared for resistance, but they clearly had not expected to encounter anyone with Ahanu's particular skills. The young Cahto appeared from the direction of the bunkhouse like a shadow detaching itself from the larger darkness. He carried no weapon that Zach could see, but he moved with the fluid purposefulness of a predator stalking prey. The horse thieves had not noticed him yet. Their attention focused on the valuable animals they were driving toward the tree line where other members of their gang waited with pack horses and supplies. Zach threw on his clothes and boots, checked his rifle, and headed for the door. But by the time he reached the porch, the situation had already changed dramatically. 3 of the thieves lay motionless on the frozen ground, and the others were backing toward their horses with the nervous energy of men who had suddenly realized that their easy robbery had become something far more dangerous. "Where is he?" one of the masked men shouted, his voice cracking with fear. "Where's the Indian? I swear he was right there a second ago." Ahanu seemed to materialize from the shadows behind another group of thieves, moving so silently that the first indication of his presence was the soft thud of bodies hitting the ground. He fought with techniques that Zach had never seen before, using his opponent's weapons against them, turning their own momentum into the source of their defeat. It was like watching a master craftsman at work, each movement precise and economical. Wasting no energy on unnecessary flourishes, the leader of the gang, a big man with silver hair visible beneath his black mask, fired his pistol toward where he thought Ahanu was standing. The bullet struck nothing but air, and a moment later the man was on his knees. His gun hand twisted at an impossible angle while Ahanu held him in a grip that looked gentle but was clearly unbreakable. "You have made a mistake," Ahanu said. Quietly, his voice carrying easily across the ranch yard despite its softness. "These horses are under my protection. I suggest you gather your wounded and leave this place before you discover what other mistakes you have made tonight. The remaining thieves needed no further encouragement. They collected their unconscious companions and rode away into the darkness, leaving behind wire cutters, coils of rope, and the distinct impression that they had encountered something far beyond their understanding or ability to handle. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 10 minutes. Zach walked slowly toward where Hanu stood in the center of the corral, surrounded by horses that should have been spooked and scattered, but instead seemed calm and attentive, as if they understood that the danger had passed. The young man was breathing slightly faster than normal, but otherwise showed no signs of the violence that had just occurred. "How did you do that?" Zach asked, still trying to process what he had witnessed. "My grandfather taught me more than just how to heal," Ahanu replied. "He said that sometimes the greatest kindness is preventing those who would do harm from completing their intentions. Those men came here to steal, but they also came prepared to kill anyone who tried to stop them. I simply made sure they understood that they had chosen the wrong target." Over the next hour, as they repaired the cut fences and secured the horses, the full scope of what had almost happened became clear. The thieves had been professionals, members of one of the organized gangs that specialized in stealing valuable livestock and selling them in distant markets, where brands could be altered and ownership obscured. They had clearly studied the double B for weeks, learning the routines of the ranch hands and timing their attack for maximum effect. They knew exactly which horses to take, Zach observed as he examined the cuts in the fence wire. Went straight for the breeding stock and ignored the workhorses. Someone gave them detailed information about the ranch. Ahanu nodded grimly. "And they knew there were only 3 of us here tonight. Old Pete is visiting his sister in town, and Tommy is laid up with that chest cold. Either they have been watching us very carefully, or someone has been reporting our activities to them." The implication hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying fire. Someone in the local community, someone with access to information about the ranch's operations and routines, had been feeding intelligence to a gang of professional horse thieves. The attack had not been a crime of opportunity, but a carefully planned operation based on inside knowledge. The answer came 3 days later, when Sheriff William Morrison rode out from Cedar Ridge with a warrant for Anu's arrest. The lawman was accompanied by 2 deputies and looked distinctly uncomfortable with his mission, his weathered face tight with the expression of a man forced to perform duties that conflicted with his personal judgment. "Morning, Zach," Morrison said as he dismounted from his horse. "I'm afraid I've got some unpleasant business to discuss with you and the boy." "What kind of business?" Zach asked, though he suspected he already knew. Morrison pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket. "Got a complaint filed yesterday by Josiah Crawford and 5 other prominent citizens of Cedar Ridge. They're charging the Indian boy with assault, practicing medicine without a license, and corrupting the morals of the community with heathen rituals." Zach felt anger rise in his chest like bile. Josiah Crawford owned the largest general store in town and had been one of the most vocal opponents of Ahanu's healing practices. The man had also been notably absent from his store on the night of the horse theft, claiming to have been visiting suppliers in Sacramento. "Those are serious charges, Sheriff," Zach said carefully. "What evidence do they have?" "Well, that's the thing," Morrison replied, looking even more uncomfortable. "Crawford says he has witnesses who saw the boy attack several men without provocation. Says it was some kind of savage violence that proves Indians can't be trusted around civilized folk. The men he attacked were stealing my horses," Zach said flatly. "Ahanu was defending my property against armed thieves. If that's a crime, then every rancher in California is a criminal." One of the deputies, a young man Zach didn't recognize, spoke up. "That's not how Crawford tells it. He says the boy used some kind of Indian magic to hurt those men, that it wasn't natural fighting but devil worship made manifest." Ahanu had been standing quietly beside the porch during this exchange. his face showing no emotion beyond polite attention. Now he stepped forward slightly, addressing Sheriff Morrison directly. "I understand there are people who fear what they do not understand," he said calmly. "If my presence here causes problems for Mr. Bishop, I will come with you willingly. But I ask that you judge me by my actions, not by the fears of people who have never spoken to me." Morrison sighed heavily. "Son, I've known Zach Bishop for 15 years, and if he says you were defending his property, that's good enough for me. But the law is the law, and when citizens file complaints, I have to investigate. You'll need to come to town for a hearing, so the judge can sort this out." The hearing was scheduled for the following Monday at the Cedar Ridge Courthouse, a small wooden building that served multiple functions in the growing frontier town. Word of the proceedings spread quickly through the community, dividing the population into two distinct camps. Those who had witnessed Ahanu's healing abilities or had benefited from them believed the charges were motivated by prejudice and fear. Those who had never seen him work, or who viewed his methods as threats to established authority, supported Crawford's accusations. On the morning of the hearing, the courthouse was packed beyond capacity. Families who had traveled from distant ranches to seek Ahanu's help sat alongside townspeople who viewed the young Cahto as everything from a miracle worker to a dangerous savage. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Judge Henry Blackwood, a stern man in his 60s who had been dispensing frontier justice for over 20 years, called the court to order with sharp raps of his gavel. The prosecution's case was presented by Crawford himself, who painted a picture of Ahanu as a dangerous primitive who used violence and superstition to prey on desperate people. "Your Honor," Crawford declared, pacing dramatically before the judge's bench, "this Indian boy represents everything that threatens the civilized development of our community. He practices medicine without training or authority, endangering the lives of innocent animals and their owners. He uses heathen rituals that corrupt the Christian faith of our citizens. And when confronted by righteous men seeking to protect their community, he responds with savage violence that proves his true nature." The testimony of Crawford's witnesses painted a picture of the horse theft incident that bore little resemblance to what had actually occurred. According to their version, Ahanu had attacked a group of concerned citizens who had come to the ranch to discuss their worries about his activities. The witnesses described the young man's fighting abilities in terms that made him sound more like a supernatural monster than a skilled human being. When it came time for the defense, Zach took the stand as the first witness. He described the actual events of the horse theft in detail, explaining how the attackers had come prepared for violence and how Ahanu had simply defended the ranch's property against armed criminals. His testimony was straightforward and factual, but Zach could see that some members of the audience remained skeptical. The turning point came when Dr. Carstairs requested permission to address the court. The distinguished physician had remained in the area after his initial visit to the Double B, conducting his own investigation into Ahanu's healing methods. His testimony carried the weight of scientific authority and academic respectability. "Your Honor," Dr. Carstairs began, "I have spent the past month observing this young man's medical practices. While his methods are certainly unconventional by the standards of formal medicine, I have documented numerous cases where his treatments have been remarkably effective. Far from being dangerous quackery, his techniques appear to combine sophisticated understanding of anatomy and physiology with traditional knowledge that mainstream medicine has largely ignored." He produced a thick notebook filled with detailed observations and case studies. "I have witnessed him successfully treat conditions that conventional veterinary medicine considers hopeless. His diagnostic abilities are extraordinary, and his treatments consistently produce positive results. To characterize such work as dangerous or fraudulent would be both scientifically inaccurate and morally unjust." The final witness was Sarah Henderson, the widow whose Mare Ahanu had saved from a life-threatening infection. She spoke simply and directly about what his help had meant to her, how he had refused payment and asked for nothing beyond the chance to help a suffering animal. Her testimony carried an emotional weight that no amount of legal rhetoric could match. Judge Blackwood deliberated for nearly an hour before returning to render his verdict. The courtroom fell silent as he prepared to speak, the tension so thick it seemed to muffle even the sound of breathing. "This court finds the charges of assault to be without merit," the judge declared. "The evidence clearly shows that Mr. Ahanu was defending private property against armed thieves, which is not only legal but commendable. As for the charges related to practicing medicine without a license, this court notes that no such licensing requirements currently exist for veterinary care in this territory. Finally, regarding the charge of corrupting community morals, this court finds no evidence that Mr. Ahanu has engaged in any activities that violate established law or threaten public safety." The courtroom erupted in a mixture of cheers and angry muttering. Crawford and his supporters were clearly dissatisfied with the verdict, while those who had witnessed Ahanu's healing work expressed relief and vindication. But the young man himself seemed unmoved by either the accusations or the exoneration, accepting both with the same quiet dignity he had shown throughout the proceedings. That evening, as they sat on the porch of the ranch house watching the sun set over the snow-covered mountains, Zach found himself thinking about how much his life had changed since Ahanu's arrival. The quiet routine of ranch work had been replaced by constant drama, conflict, and controversy. Yet despite the complications, he found himself unable to imagine the Double B without the young Cahto's presence. "Do you regret staying?" Zach asked. "After everything that's happened, all the trouble and accusations?" Ahanu was quiet for a long moment, watching the last light of day paint the distant peaks in shades of rose and gold. "My grandmother used to say that trouble and accusations are just wind," he said finally. "They make a lot of noise, but they cannot change the essential nature of who you are or what you are meant to do. I came here to work with horses, but I have found something more important." "What's that?" "I have found a place where my gifts are valued more than they are feared," Ahanu replied. "And I have found a friend who judges me by my actions rather than by the stories other people tell about me. That is worth any amount of trouble." As the stars emerged in the clear winter sky, Zach Bishop reflected on the strange journey that had brought them to this moment. He had hired a Cahto boy to tend his horses, and had gained not just exceptional skill with animals, but wisdom, friendship, and a connection to something larger than his own grief and isolation. The road ahead would undoubtedly bring new challenges, but for the first time since Catherine's death, he felt ready to face whatever came with hope rather than resignation. February 1877. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning when the February wind carried the bitter promise of the last winter storm. Zach found it slipped under the kitchen door, written on expensive paper in a woman's careful handwriting. The return address made his heart stop: Catherine Bishop Memorial Hospital, San Francisco. His wife's maiden name used for an institution he had never heard of. The letter was from Dr. Margaret Ashford, the hospital's chief administrator, requesting Zach's presence at a ceremony honoring his late wife's contributions to medical research. Catherine had apparently willed her personal journals and botanical specimens to the University of California, documents that had been instrumental in developing new treatments for consumption and other respiratory ailments. The hospital had been founded using funds from her estate, money Zach had never known existed. "I don't understand," Zach said, showing the letter to Ahanu as they sat at the kitchen table over morning coffee. "Catherine never mentioned having money set aside, and I certainly never heard anything about medical research." Ahanu read the letter carefully, his dark eyes moving thoughtfully over the formal language. Perhaps she wanted it to be a surprise, something discovered only after her death. The letter says she spent years documenting the healing properties of plants native to these mountains. That kind of knowledge would be valuable to doctors trying to help people with the same sickness that took her. The ceremony was scheduled for the following weekend, and Dr. Ashford had specifically requested that Zach bring any individuals who might have contributed to Mrs. Bishop's understanding of indigenous healing practices. The wording was curious, almost as if the hospital administrator knew about Ahanu's presence at the ranch. 3 days later, Zach and Ahanu made the long journey to San Francisco, riding the train from Sacramento through the Oakland Hills to the bustling metropolis that had grown up around the Great Bay. For Ahanu, who had spent his entire life in the mountains and valleys of Northern California, the city was a revelation of noise, smells, and human activity unlike anything he had ever experienced. The Catherine Bishop Memorial Hospital was a modern brick building in the heart of the city's medical district, its clean lines and large windows speaking of progressive ideas about health and healing. Dr. Ashford met them in the lobby. A woman in her 40s with graying hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "Mr. Bishop," she said, extending her hand in greeting, "thank you so much for coming. Your wife's work has been invaluable to our understanding of respiratory diseases, and we wanted to honor her memory properly." She turned to Ahanu with obvious curiosity. "And you must be the young man Mrs. Bishop wrote about in her later journals. She described you as possessing extraordinary knowledge of traditional healing methods." Zach stared at Dr. Ashford in confusion. "Catherine wrote about Ahanu? But she died 3 years ago, and he only came to the ranch last autumn." Dr. Ashford's eyebrows raised. "I think there may be some misunderstanding. According to her journals, Mrs. Bishop met this young man during her final summer, when she was studying plant medicines in the hope of finding treatments for her own condition. Her notes describe lengthy conversations with a Cahto healer who shared traditional knowledge about respiratory ailments. The ceremony itself was held in the hospital's main auditorium, attended by doctors, researchers, and prominent citizens who had contributed to the institution's founding. As Dr. Ashford read excerpts from Catherine's journals, Zach felt as if he was learning about his wife all over again. The woman he had thought he knew completely had apparently been conducting sophisticated medical research, corresponding with physicians throughout California, and documenting healing practices that most white settlers ignored or dismissed. Mrs. Bishop's final entries, Dr. Ashford read, describe her meetings with a young Cahto man whose grandmother possessed encyclopedic knowledge of medicinal plants. She wrote, "Today I learned that what we call consumption, the Cahto people call the coughing death, and they have treatments that go back generations. The young healer, who cannot be more than 16, understands the connection between lung disease and spiritual imbalance in ways that our medical schools have never considered." After the ceremony, Dr. Ashford led them to a private office where Catherine's original journals were displayed under glass. Zach recognized his wife's handwriting immediately, but the content was entirely unfamiliar. Page after page documented her conversations with Ahanu, detailed descriptions of plant medicines, and theoretical discussions about the relationship between physical and spiritual healing. "She never told me about any of this," Zach said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I knew she was interested in gardening and plants, but I had no idea she was conducting medical research." Ahanu stood silently beside him, studying the journal pages with an expression that mixed sadness with something that might have been recognition. Finally, he spoke. "She made me promise not to tell you about our meetings. She said you were already carrying too much worry about her sickness, and she didn't want to add to your burden by letting you know how desperately she was searching for a cure." The revelation hit Zach like a physical blow. While he had been focused on ranch work and everyday routines, Catherine had been fighting her disease with every tool at her disposal, reaching out to traditional healers and documenting their knowledge for the benefit of future patients. She had been conducting her own private war against the consumption that was killing her, and she had done it alone to protect him from additional pain. "The treatments we discussed," Ahanu continued, his voice soft with memory, "she tried many of them. Some helped with the coughing and pain, but by the time we met, the sickness had progressed too far for any medicine to cure. She knew she was dying, but she wanted to make sure the knowledge wouldn't die with her. Dr. Ashford opened another display case, revealing dried plant specimens labeled in Catherine's careful handwriting. Your wife's botanical collection has already led to 3 new treatments, currently being tested in hospitals throughout California. Her work bridging traditional indigenous knowledge with modern medical practice has saved lives and will continue to do so for years to come. That evening, as they sat in their hotel room overlooking the bustling streets of San Francisco, Zach found himself seeing his marriage and his wife's death in an entirely different light. Catherine had not been the passive victim of disease he had imagined, but an active researcher fighting for her life and the lives of others who would face the same battle. Her final months had been spent not just in suffering, but in purposeful work that extended far beyond her own mortality. "Why didn't you tell me?" Zach asked Ahanu. "After she died, after all these months, why keep her secret?" Ahanu was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the gas lamps that lined the streets below. "Because she asked me to protect you from guilt that was not yours to carry. She knew that if you learned about her research, you would blame yourself for not helping more, for not understanding what she was going through. She loved you too much to leave you with that burden." The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to their hotel. A well-dressed Chinese man in his 30s knocked on their door, introducing himself as Dr. James Wong, a physician who had worked closely with Catherine during her final months. His presence explained another mystery that had puzzled Zach since arriving in San Francisco. "Your wife sought me out because I had experience with both Western medicine and traditional Chinese healing practices," Dr. Wong explained as they sat in the hotel's small restaurant. She believed that the future of medicine lay in combining the best knowledge from all cultures, rather than dismissing treatments simply because they originated outside formal medical schools. He produced a leather portfolio filled with correspondence between himself and Catherine. "We exchanged letters for nearly 2 years, discussing various approaches to respiratory diseases. She was particularly interested in the similarities between Chinese concepts of qi and the Cahto understanding of life force. Her insights helped me develop treatments that have been remarkably successful." Dr. Wong turned to Ahanu with obvious respect. "Your discussions with Mrs. Bishop about the spiritual aspects of healing influenced medical practice far beyond what you might have imagined. The integration of emotional and spiritual care with physical treatment is now being implemented in hospitals throughout the western United States." As they prepared to return to the ranch, Dr. Ashford made one final request. The hospital was establishing a research program focused on traditional healing practices, and they wanted Ahanu to serve as a consultant, helping to document and preserve indigenous medical knowledge before it was lost forever. "We would provide proper compensation, of course," Dr. Ashford explained, "and the work could be done primarily through correspondence, with only occasional trips to the city. Your knowledge, combined with Mrs. Bishop's research, could help establish an entirely new approach to medical care." The train ride back to Sacramento gave them time to discuss this unexpected opportunity. Ahanu seemed simultaneously honored by the request and concerned about leaving the ranch for extended periods. The work would require him to share sacred knowledge that had been passed down through generations of Cahto healers, information that was traditionally kept within the tribe. "My grandmother always said that healing knowledge belongs to all people, not just to those who were born into it," Ahanu said as they watched the California landscape roll past the train windows. "But she also taught me to be careful about who I trusted with such knowledge, because it could be misused by those who saw it only as a way to gain power or wealth." Zach found himself thinking about the changes that Ahanu's arrival had brought to his life. The young man had given him back his horses during the midnight recovery, had saved Thunder's life with traditional healing methods, had defended the ranch against armed thieves, and had now revealed a connection to Catherine that reframed his understanding of his wife's final months. Each revelation had opened new possibilities while also raising new questions about the nature of healing, wisdom, and the connections between seemingly separate worlds. When they arrived back at the Double B, the ranch felt different somehow. The familiar buildings and fences looked the same, but Zach saw them now through eyes that had been open to possibilities he had never considered. Catherine's presence seemed stronger rather than more distant, as if learning about her secret. Research had brought her closer rather than emphasizing her absence. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the western mountains, Ahanu made his decision about Dr. Ashford's offer. "I will help them document the traditional knowledge, but only if you agree to be part of the work." Catherine's research began here, with conversations between people who trusted each other. That kind of trust cannot be recreated in a hospital or university. It can only grow from friendship and shared purpose. Zach felt something settle into place in his chest, a sense of rightness that he had not experienced since Catherine's death. "You want me to help preserve traditional healing knowledge? I don't know anything about medicine. You know about creating the conditions where healing can happen," Ahanu replied. "That is what you have done for me, and what Catherine did before you. You provide the trust and safety that allows people to share their deepest knowledge without fear. That is a gift as rare and valuable as any medical technique." As the stars emerged in the clear mountain sky, Zach Bishop realized that his life had taken another unexpected turn. The lonely rancher who had hired a Cahto boy to tend his horses was now being invited to help preserve and share traditional healing wisdom with the modern world. It was not the future he had planned, but it felt like the future he was meant to have. The wind that night carried the scent of snow from the high peaks, but also the softer promise of spring stirring beneath winter's grip. Change was coming. To the Double B Ranch, change that would honor both the traditional wisdom of the past and the healing possibilities of the future. And for the first time since Catherine's death, Zach found himself looking forward to tomorrow rather than simply enduring it. Spring 1877. The transformation began with the arrival of the first spring wildflowers, their delicate blooms pushing through the last patches of winter snow like promises written in petals and color. Zach stood in the meadow where Catherine had once gathered healing plants, watching Ahanu carefully harvest specimens for their new partnership with the Catherine Bishop Memorial Hospital. The young man moved through the field with reverent precision, taking only what was needed and leaving offerings of tobacco and sage to honor the spirits of the plants. 6 weeks had passed since their return from San Francisco, and the Double B Ranch had become something neither man had expected. What had started as a simple employer-employer relationship had evolved into a true partnership, with Ahanu's traditional knowledge and Zach's practical experience combining to create something entirely new. The first major test came when a telegram arrived from Dr. Carstairs in Berkeley. A wealthy railroad baron named Harrison Caldwell had brought his daughter Emma to California, seeking treatment for a mysterious illness that had baffled doctors across the country. The 12-year-old girl was dying, and conventional medicine had exhausted its options. Traditional healing works best when there is trust between healer and patient, Ahanu said after reading the telegram. Rich people often want miracles without understanding. But a sick child is a sick child, regardless of her father's wealth. They traveled to San Francisco the following week, where Harrison Caldwell met them at the Palace Hotel. His expensive clothes could not mask the desperation in his eyes as he led them to his daughter's suite on the top floor. Emma Caldwell was a pale, thin child who looked far younger than her 12 years. She lay in an enormous bed, surrounded by bottles of medicine that had clearly done nothing to improve her condition. But when Ahanu entered the room, her dull eyes brightened with the first sign of interest anyone had seen in weeks. What followed was unlike any medical examination Zach had ever witnessed. Ahanu spent nearly an hour simply talking with Emma, asking about her dreams, her fears, her memories of being healthy. Only after this lengthy conversation did he begin the physical examination, using methods that were clearly foreign to the attending physicians. "Her body is not sick," Ahanu announced after completing his examination. "Her spirit is sick. Something has frightened her so badly that her life force has begun to withdraw." Through gentle questioning, the truth emerged. 6 months earlier, Emma had witnessed a terrible accident during a family trip to their summer home. A young servant boy had fallen from a cliff while picking berries for her lunch, dying while she watched helplessly. The trauma had been so severe that her mind had buried the memory, but her spirit had never recovered from the shock. "The boy's death was not your fault," Ahanu said gently, taking Emma's small hand in his. "But your spirit believes it was. And that guilt is like poison in your blood. We need to help your spirit understand that witnessing tragedy does not make you responsible for causing it." The healing process took 3 days and combined traditional Cahto practices with innovations Ahanu had developed through his work with Catherine's research. He prepared herbal teas that helped Emma sleep without nightmares, conducted ceremonies that honored the memory of the dead servant boy, and taught her meditation techniques that reconnected her spirit to her physical body. By the end of the third day, Emma was sitting up in bed, eating solid food for the first time in months, and speaking in a clear voice. The attending physicians were stunned, unable to explain the transformation using any medical theory they had learned. Harrison Caldwell offered Ahanu a fortune for his services, but the young healer declined most of the payment, accepting only enough to cover their expenses and a modest contribution to Catherine's hospital. "Healing is not a business transaction," he explained. "It is a sacred trust between people who need help and those who have knowledge to offer." The success with Emma Caldwell established Ahanu's reputation throughout California's medical community, bringing requests for consultation from physicians dealing with cases that conventional treatment could not address. The Double B Ranch became an unlikely center for medical education, hosting physicians, researchers, and traditional healers from throughout the western United States. The most significant visitor arrived in late spring when an elderly Cahto woman walked up the ranch road with the same silent grace that had characterized Ahanu's first approach. She introduced herself as Singing Crow, Ahanu's great-aunt and one of the last keepers of traditional Cahto healing knowledge. "I have heard stories," she said in heavily accented but clear English, "about a young man who shares the old knowledge with people who have forgotten how to listen to the earth. Some of the elders worry that sacred teachings are being given away too freely." What followed was a 3-day ceremony unlike anything Zach had ever imagined. Singing Crow tested Ahanu's knowledge, challenged his understanding of traditional protocols, and evaluated his judgment about when and how to share sacred information. The ceremony culminated with her formal recognition of Ahanu as a traditional healer qualified to teach others. More importantly, she also recognized Zach as what she called a bridge person, someone who could help translate between different worlds of knowledge and understanding. "You have created something new here," Singing Crow told them as the ceremony concluded. "Not fully traditional, not fully modern, but something that honors both ways of understanding the world. This is what will be needed as the old world and the new world learn to exist together." That summer, the first class of the Catherine Bishop Institute for Integrated Medicine convened in a building constructed specifically for the purpose, on the grounds of the Double B Ranch. 24 students, including both conventionally trained physicians and traditional healers from various Native American tribes, gathered to learn techniques that combine the best aspects of multiple healing traditions. Zach served as the Institute's administrative director, but his role went far beyond mere administration. He had become the trusted intermediary who helped traditional healers feel safe sharing their knowledge and helped conventional physicians overcome their skepticism about indigenous practices. The transformation was perhaps most evident in the horses. The original herd had grown to over 100 animals, including not just Zach's breeding stock, but horses brought by visitors seeking the Hanu's healing abilities. The ranch had become a refuge for animals that had been given up as hopeless by conventional veterinary medicine. As autumn approached, bringing with it the first anniversary of a Hanu's arrival at the Double B, Zach found himself reflecting on the extraordinary changes that had transformed his life. The lonely rancher who had hired a Cahto boy to tend his horses had become a partner in work that was changing the practice of medicine throughout the American West. "Do you ever miss the simple days?" Zach asked one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sun set over mountains that no longer seemed empty but full of possibility. Hanu smiled, one of the genuine expressions of joy that had become more frequent as their partnership deepened. "I miss the quietness sometimes," he admitted, "but I do not miss the loneliness that came with it. My grandmother used to say that knowledge kept to yourself is like a fire that gives no warmth to others. What we have built here allows the fire to spread without consuming the wood." As the stars emerged in the clear mountain sky, Zach Bishop realized that his life had found a purpose larger than personal happiness or individual success. The Double B Ranch had become something that honored Catherine's memory while creating possibilities she could never have imagined. The lonely rancher and the Cahto boy had discovered that healing others was the most profound way to heal themselves. The night wind carried the scent of sage and wildflowers, medicines that grew wild in the mountains and healing that flourished when different kinds of wisdom learned to work together. Tomorrow would bring new students, new challenges, and new opportunities to bridge worlds that had been separated too long. But tonight, in the peaceful darkness of the ranch they had built together, two friends who had found family in each other, prepared to face whatever the future might hold.
Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.